I've been creating a course that I call Nervous System Regulation Through Nature. And part of this course is describing how our modern, especially indoor living environments, are literally full of ways that creates nervous system disturbances and nervous system dysregulation. And so one of the things that I highlight in this course is the concept of non-native EMFs, which stands for non-native electromagnetic frequencies or non-native electromagnetic radiation, and how our modern interior environments are full of them. Modern living is really, we use radiation emitting devices all the time. And I don't think we realize that there are potential health consequences for it. And so I want to dive a little bit deeper into this, just to kind of give some education around it. I truly believe that you get to choose what you want to do and what types of devices you want to incorporate in your life. But I also believe that a lot of people are uninformed about this. So here's just, I have a couple of slides here I want to share to be able to just to start this educational conversation. And so first and foremost, I want people to see that electromagnetic fields or electromagnetic radiation, some of it is very natural. And in fact, if you look directly towards the middle of this chart right here, you'll see that visible light, which would be the light emitted from the sun, also including the infrared spectrum and the ultraviolet spectrum. All of these electromagnetic radiations emanate from the sun. And so I'm not saying that all types of electromagnetic radiation are harmful. However, I do want people to realize that there is a misconception here that we're talking about. And so the misconception was developed, decades and decades ago, especially when they started researching ultraviolet light and the potential damaging effects of ultraviolet light in a laboratory setting. Now, I say laboratory setting because when they were researching the damaging effects of ultraviolet light on cells and animals, they literally would use a petri dish with cells in it, or like hairless rats and hairless mice, for example, and shine a very powerful arc lamp, it was called, on the cells in the petri dish or on the animals, and then assess to see what was happening with the DNA of these cells and of these creatures. And now, mind you, this arc lamp is very similar to the type of welder's arc that are used by welders. And my husband was a welder. And so I know that they wear a lot of protection when it comes to utilizing this very strong ultraviolet source. And that's because this is just straight up UV, right? It doesn't have the blend of frequencies, especially the very soothing anti-inflammatory blend of the infrared and red spectrum of light that we always would have from sun. So anytime ultraviolet light is present in sunlight, it's always balanced by containing at least 40 to 50% of its spectrum in the soothing anti-inflammatory red and infrared spectrum. So we have this arc lamp, right? And it's shining onto cells and animals, and they're showing that the DNA can be mutated. So anyways, it's not an apples to oranges comparison when it comes to sunlight and this arc lamp. But what happened here was they showed mutation. And so they started to create a category of what are harmful sources of electromagnetic radiation. And they basically classified and broke this chart up into what would be called ionizing radiation that you see, which contains the ultraviolet, X-rays, and gamma rays, those types of rays. Those are shorter wavelengths, which you see delineated by that up and down line at the top. It's a shorter wavelength and does contain a very powerful amount of radiation. And so it has the ability to literally, the radiation has the ability to literally mutate the DNA, which is why anytime someone gets an X-ray, they put a lead shield over them in order to prevent that X-ray from reaching healthy cells and potentially causing mutations. And so that was called ionizing radiation. It literally can ionize the DNA and create mutations. Now, the other portion of the spectrum, it's a longer wavelength and has much less power associated with it. And that's typically the visible light, the infrared light, and then the microwave radiation and the radio frequency radiation. And these are things nowadays that we would see incorporated in radio towers that are broadcasting, their AM and FM stations. We see it extensively now in cell phone radiation and anything that contains wireless technology. So any smart technology, any Bluetooth technology, any wireless technology is going to have this type of wireless radiation. And when they were originally studying the health effects of this wireless radiation, they said it can't possibly be harmful to humans because, number one, it's not strong enough to mutate the DNA. And number two, those radio and microwave frequency radiations are not powerful enough to heat up the tissue. And so there can't be any possible harmful effects of this. Now, fast forward to research that's been done since at least the 1970s on this type of radiation. Specifically at that time, we were dealing more with the radio frequency radiation, and has since been, we've seen experiments with things like cell phone radiation. We now know that that form of radiation, it can be biologically harmful because it's in the gentle or lower intensity frequency that the human body actually uses to communicate with itself. Every single one of my cells emits this low frequency radiation, and uses it to communicate with other parts of the body, with other cells. Mitochondria use it to communicate with other mitochondria. And so now we're actually bathing in the number was 10 to the 18th times more of this type of radiation now over the past 100 years. It's just accumulated. And that data point comes from 2010. Think about now 14 years later, where we've introduced 3G, 4G, 5G, and all of our smart technologies and Bluetooth technologies. So we're literally bathing in this, and it's interfering with cellular communication. It's interfering with the health, with human health, but not just humans. It's interfering with the health of plants, insects, and animals as well. So let's dive into this a little bit more. I want you to know that this is the type of, it's non-ionizing. It's not going to directly mutate the DNA, but it can have potential harmful effects on all of creation. So here's a study that was done, and you can see who it was courtesy of. And this was done in 1996. And what this looked at was how much of a cell phone's radiation penetrates into the skull, through the skull and into the brain of a 5-year-old, a 10-year-old, and an adult. And what we see is that 5-year-olds have extreme penetration. When that cell phone is up next to the side of the head, there's extreme penetration of that radiation into the brain. And we're going to talk about what might be happening at the level of the mitochondria here to create overall harmful inflammatory effects in the body. Obviously, the 10-year-old has a lot of penetration as well. And then even an adult, right? It goes almost to the halfway point of the brain. Now, I want you to take a look at this chart on the right. This is courtesy of a very great web page right here. And I encourage you to Google the Macintosh how-to EMF exposure Apple AirPods. Google this and take a look, because on this individual's website, he provides 3 different videos about how he's measuring the radiation using his meter, and is measuring the radiation from a cell phone, from AirPods, and then from AirPods when you eventually put them into their case. And I'm going to talk about that in a second. Now, what you'll see here is a cell phone. That if we're just talking on a cell phone, it's emitting at the level, and I'm not going to talk about, the microwatts. I'm not going to talk about the exact what would you call it, units that we're measuring. I don't want to overcomplicate this, but what I want you to see is that on a spectrum of the amount of radiation that's being emitted, talking on an iPhone to the side of your head versus having AirPods in your ears has a 10-fold increase in the amount of radiation that we're being exposed to. So now picture what's happening when we have that iPhone just on our physical bodies, and then we have AirPods in our ears, which happens, I see it all the time, and people are unaware. And while that iPhone really the radiation goes up drastically when we're on a cellular phone call, when we're actually using mobile data, the Apple AirPods never turn off. They are going constantly, regardless of whether we're listening to something through the AirPods or not. And so now all of a sudden, you see that all of us that are wearing these AirPods and also have a phone, that penetration into the brain all the time can be very drastic. It could be very, very damaging and very inflammatory. And so I highly encourage you to look at those videos, especially if you want to educate other people or educate specifically. I love this to educate the youth here about why we might not want to be using these devices, especially the ones that are directly physically in our ears and on our physical bodies. Okay, so I'm going to stop the share for a second here. And I want to talk about what are the potential health consequences? Like, what are we looking at? And again, this research has been going on since, like I was saying, early 1970s. There was a researcher named Alan Frey who dove deep into this. There's a phenomenal book by a researcher named Arthur Furstenberg called The Invisible Rainbow. I highly, highly recommend it if you're interested in diving deeper into this. There's also a great website called cellphonetaskforce.org, where they've got so many actual published scientific research articles on this. So when people say, show me the research, I mean, it's there. I've actually presented on this I presented on this in particular through the lens of infertility. Rates of infertility are skyrocketing. And yes, our toxin exposure is skyrocketing. Yes, our circadian rhythm is disrupted more than ever. So that means our hormonal balance is being disrupted. But simply having exposures to this radiation alone can drive infertility, amongst a whole other host of challenges. So let's talk about this, because sometimes people aren't willing to listen to this if they hear that the challenges are to human health, because it's general human nature. If I'm using something that's convenient and easy and I like it, AirPods in my ear with my cell phone, then I may like put up a barrier, right? And so let's talk about this through the lens of things like honeybees, through the lens of migratory birds, right? Things that might open our brain to seeing the potential harms of excessively utilizing this non-native EMF technology. So there were scientists in 2014 at a university in Germany, and what they were shocked at is they were studying migratory birds, right? And they were shocked to find that their migratory songbirds could no longer orient towards the north in the spring and towards the southwest in the autumn. They literally lost their ability to sense Earth's magnetic field lines, which is what they used to migrate. And so what they decided to do is they decided to actually keep their migratory songbirds that they were studying in a shielded environment, meaning they shielded their aviary from the microwave and radio wave frequency radiation, right? The cell phone radiation. And that all of a sudden the following spring, the following spring, the birds were able to face north and migrate again, right? And so we have to realize that this is impacting like really important things, such as the migratory effects or the migratory needs of birds. It's been studied in the migratory needs of butterflies. I have not looked into it, but I would be curious to see if it was studied in the migratory needs of even our underwater creatures. So again, something's up with this, and it has to spark our curiosity. There's a professor at the Punjab University in India as well, and she was working with honeybees. And she was trying to understand what's causing what's called colony collapse disorder in honeybees. We know that this is a very important thing to pay attention to, because without the honeybees, the whole entire ecosystem can collapse. And so what she wanted to do was she put two cell phones. She had 4 hives, right? In 2 of the hives, she put cell phones, and she just turned them on for only 15 minutes at a time, right? Twice a day. And so over the course of 3 months, in those particular hives only, not the other hives. So in only those 2 particular hives, she found that there was no honey, no pollen, no brood, and no bees, right? So this is definitely something that can be affecting the honeybee populations. She took it a step further. She's like, what is going on? And so she decided to start studying the hemolymph in the bees. Hemolymph is akin to the bee blood, right? Very similar to, what we would call our blood. And the hemolymph, what she found was that literally there was no signs of cellular respiration, meaning in the same way that we transform oxygen and electrons into water and ATP, that particular mechanism in the honeybees went to a standstill. And so this happened just 10 minutes after exposure. She found that it didn't take a long time to start to see derangements in this. Literally after exposure for just 10 minutes, the bees were starting to become unable to metabolize any sugars, fats, or proteins. I mean, this is huge, right? If we're literally affecting the ability of creatures to utilize fuel and metabolize it and burn it for energy and sustain life, again, we have to ask the question, what is going on here? And is there something that we need to do about it? Interestingly, too, I found the studies on they've done a lot of studies in this field where they've tagged different animals. And sometimes they'll tag them with a plain tag, meaning for example, in one study, they tagged calves, a group of calves, moose calves. And they tagged them with 10% of them. Or I'm sorry, they tagged one group of them, split them in half, tagged one group with just plain ear tags, right? So the ones that were just regular markers, not emitting any tracking or any radiation whatsoever. And in the other group, they tagged it with a transmitter tag, right? So one that was continuously emitting radio wave radiation, radio frequency radiation. And what they found was that in the plain ear tags, they had a 10% mortality over the course of the study or of the observation period. Whereas the calves that were tagged with the radio emitting or radiation emitting tag had almost a 70% mortality rate, 68% to be exact. So again, what is going on here? These are fascinating things that we have to ask ourselves. Is this radiation detrimental to life, right? Detrimental to the health of all creation? And so bottom line is these radio waves can really interfere in humans with the electron transport chain, right? So the ability of all of the mitochondria in our bodies to, like I said, convert fuel, which would potentially be food, it would be electrons, it would be charge, into water and ATP. And if you've been listening to any of the stuff I've taught for quite some time, you know both of those are vital. The ATP actually helps our proteins work at optimum capacity, whereas the water is our battery of life. It literally provides a zone of negative charge, this healthy charge that all of our cells need to maintain in order to have optimum energy and optimum work capacity. And so if we start to deplete our cells of that, it's no wonder that we're going to start to see all sorts of signs and symptoms or all sorts of dis-ease, essentially, as we continue to increase the amounts of non-native EMFs that we're being exposed to and that we're choosing to expose ourselves to as well. And so there's definitely signs and symptoms, right? So what you're going to find is, I'm going to list, just a smattering, but a sampling, kind of a broad sampling of the signs and symptoms or the health repercussions we've seen in studies related to non-native EMF exposure or non-native electromagnetic radiation exposure. And it's everything from memory loss, insomnia, cognitive impairment, Alzheimer's disease. We'll see cardiac symptoms like palpitations and arrhythmias, changes in blood pressure, inability to control the heart rate. In the respiratory system, we'll see sinusitis, so inflammation of the sinus path, sinus canals. We'll see dermatological things. So sometimes people are so sensitive that they get skin rashes and face flushing. Often it's associated with tinnitus or ringing in the ears. We'll see a decreased sperm count and motility, abnormal menstruation, infertility, increased risk of miscarriage and birth defects. We see changes in the markers of changes in blood markers, such as low platelets, high or low white blood cells, elevated cholesterol, although I don't think cholesterol is an enemy. And then, other things as well. We'll see just random things like a greater need for thirst or feeling of dehydration. And that, I think, also has to do with the fact that Dr. Pollack's lab showed that exposure to wireless radiation literally shrinks this water battery inside of us, this easy water. And so I just really hope this starts to maybe pique curiosity, right? And maybe not you, because maybe you have been following the stuff for quite some time and you understand that our increasing exposures to things like wireless Apple Watches or wireless AirPods, wireless cell phones, smart technology workstations, or our exposure to having a smart speaker in every room, or wireless TVs, you name it, they're everywhere, including in our mobile cars as well, or not our mobile cars, they're mobile, including in our cars as well. And so I'm hoping that maybe this just encourages you to continue to research more into this and to ask some questions and to maybe think about your usage. There's ways that we can mitigate it, from actually just choosing not to use wireless devices. I've hardwired everything as much as I can in my house, from my workstation with Ethernet, all hardwired, monitors and keyboards and mouse, so I hardwire this. And when I use my EMF meter to measure it, my radiation is next to nothing. I do not use my cell phone on my body. I do not hold it against my head. I use it on airplane mode as much as possible. If I need to put it in a Faraday pouch, I will put it in a Faraday pouch. And so we need to think about maybe how we use the wireless technologies or which technologies we choose to engage with. And I think this conversation can get expanded, right? In terms of there is the potential to create smarter, less harmful wireless technology for us. That's definitely a possibility. I also encourage you to look into the work of Ibrahim Karim and biogeometry, because we have to start, he has proven that you can literally use geometrical shape. He's been studying this for 50 years and has shown in massive studies, large scale studies, that you can take certain geometrical shapes, position them in key ways and places, and you can transform the non-native EMFs that are causing the harmful detrimental effects into ones that are actually biologically not harmful. Maybe I'm going to say biologically neutral, or less harmful, or maybe even biologically beneficial, right? So we have to start to understand that it's not about choosing technology or not, that there are ways out there that we can start to explore and encourage. We need to encourage the development of these smarter uses of either harmonizing our environment and making those waves not as negatively impactful, along with the development of technologies that do not create these harmful effects in the first place. So thanks for listening, and I'll talk with you next time.